There is a version of you that has never known lack, never known confusion, never spent a sleepless night rehearsing the same problem over and over, searching for an exit that never appeared. There is a version of you that moves through this world with a certainty so deep, so unshakable, that circumstances bend around it the way water bends around stone. That version of you is not a future possibility. It is not a reward waiting at the end of some long spiritual journey. It is not reserved for saints or scholars or people who were born with some divine advantage you were somehow denied. That version of you is available right now, in this moment, through a single shift in how you think. And that shift is what Joseph Murphy spent his entire life trying to show the world. Most people have heard the name Joseph Murphy. Most people know he wrote about the power of the subconscious mind. But most people completely missed the deeper current running beneath everything he ever taught. They took his techniques, the affirmations, the bedtime prayers, the repetitive statements, and they turned them into a self-help routine. They made it mechanical. They made it surface level. And then they wondered why it worked sometimes and not others, why it worked for certain people and seemed to fail them entirely. The reason is this: Joseph Murphy was not teaching techniques. He was teaching a way of being. He was teaching a level of consciousness. He was pointing, always pointing, toward something he called thinking like God. And until you understand what that actually means, not religiously, not metaphorically, but structurally, as a precise description of how consciousness operates, you will keep getting inconsistent results. You will keep feeling like something is missing, because something is. Here is what nobody tells you about the mind of Christ as Joseph Murphy understood it. It is not a moral achievement. It is not the reward you receive after years of discipline and devotion. It is not something you qualify for by being good enough, faithful enough, or spiritually advanced enough. The mind of Christ is a cognitive position. It is a place you think from. And the moment you occupy that position, the moment you genuinely shift into it, the laws of your mind begin operating at a completely different level. Problems that seemed permanent dissolve. Conditions that appeared fixed begin to move. Not because you forced them, not because you worked harder or prayed louder, but because the level of consciousness from which you are operating has changed. And when consciousness changes, everything it produces changes with it. Joseph Murphy understood something that most teachers are still afraid to say plainly. He understood that the God he spoke about was not a being outside of you waiting to be persuaded. He understood that the infinite intelligence he wrote about was not a force separate from your mind that you had to somehow convince or appease. He understood that the divine mind and your mind, at their deepest level, are not two things. They are one thing operating at different levels of awareness. And the mind of Christ, as he taught it, is simply the mind that has woken up to this fact. It is the mind that stops operating from separation and starts operating from union. And that one shift, that one inner movement from separation to union, from smallness to wholeness, from doubt to knowing, changes absolutely everything. Let me tell you what thinking like God actually looks like in practice, because this is where most people lose the thread. They imagine it means thinking grand thoughts, cosmic thoughts, thoughts of infinite power and divine glory. They imagine it requires some kind of elevated spiritual state they don't yet have access to. But that is not what Murphy meant. When Joseph Murphy talked about thinking like God, he was pointing to something very specific. He was pointing to the nature of the subconscious mind itself. You see, the subconscious does not know the word impossible. It does not recognize limitation. It does not distinguish between what the world calls realistic and what the world calls a dream. It accepts whatever is impressed upon it with feeling and acts on that impression with total commitment. It does not argue. It does not negotiate. It does not ask whether you deserve the outcome. It simply creates. That is how God thinks, without limitation, without doubt, without the constant editorial commentary of a mind that has been trained to expect failure. So when Murphy said, "Think like God," he was saying this. Stop filtering your inner life through the evidence of your circumstances. Stop letting the outer world set the ceiling of what you believe is possible for you. Stop giving your subconscious mind a diet of fear and limitation and then expecting it to produce abundance and freedom. Think from wholeness. Think from the assumption that what you desire is not only possible, but already complete in the deeper dimension of consciousness. Because in that deeper dimension, in the subconscious, in what Murphy called infinite intelligence, it already is complete. The pattern already exists. The blueprint is already drawn. Your only job is to stop contradicting it with the surface noise of a worried, reactive, evidence-dependent conscious mind. Here is a story that will make this concrete. A man came to Joseph Murphy broken in the way that goes deeper than circumstance. He had lost his business. He had lost the confidence that he would ever rebuild it. And what was worse, far worse than the external loss, was the story he had been telling himself about what that loss meant. He had begun to believe that he was the kind of man things fell apart for, that something in him was fundamentally unsuited for the life he wanted. He had tried affirmations. He had tried positive thinking. He had stood in the mirror and told himself he was successful while everything inside him called it a lie. And Murphy listened to all of this. He let the man speak until there was nothing left to say. And then he asked a single question. He said, "When you close your eyes and go to that quiet place just before sleep, what do you assume is true about you?" The man thought about it for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I assume it's over for me." And Murphy said, "Then that is your real prayer. Not the words you say, not the affirmations you recite. That assumption, that feeling, that is what your subconscious hears. That is what it is building. This is the teaching that most people never fully receive. Your real prayer is not your words. Your real prayer is your dominant assumption. It is the thing you accept as true at the level beneath thought, the level where feeling lives, where identity lives, where the subconscious receives its instructions. And if your dominant assumption is one of limitation, of being the kind of person things don't work out for, of being somehow excluded from the abundance and wholeness that others seem to access, then no technique will save you. No affirmation spoken from that assumption will produce a different result. Because the subconscious does not respond to words. It responds to the emotional reality behind the words. It responds to what you actually believe, not what you wish you believed. This is why Murphy was so insistent about a concept most people gloss over. He called it the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and people misunderstand this completely. They think it means manufacturing false excitement, convincing yourself to feel happy about something you don't yet have. That is not it. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is not an emotion you produce on command. It is a state you inhabit. It is the inner atmosphere of someone for whom the thing is already done. It is the settled, quiet, unforced certainty of the architect who holds the finished blueprint. He is not excited in a frantic way. He is not forcing himself to believe. He simply knows. And from that knowing he acts. From that knowing he speaks. From that knowing he moves through the world. And the world, which is nothing more than a reflection of his dominant inner state, rearranges itself to match that knowing. Joseph Murphy called this the transcendence of limitation, and he was precise about what that word means. To transcend a limitation does not mean to fight it. It does not mean to deny it exists in your current experience. It does not mean to push against it with effort and willpower until it finally breaks. Transcendence means to rise above the level at which the limitation exists. It means to operate from a level of consciousness where the limitation simply does not apply. Think about this carefully. When you are absorbed in a problem, when you are thinking from inside the problem, analyzing it, worrying about it, rehearsing it, you are at the same level as the problem. And at that level, it is enormous. It fills your entire field of awareness. It feels permanent. It feels like the truth about your life. But the moment you rise, the moment you shift your point of consciousness upward to the level where the problem is already solved, where the desire is already fulfilled, where the limitation is already transcended, the problem does not disappear from your experience because you fought it. It dissolves because you stopped feeding it with your attention from inside it. This is what it means to think like God. God does not look at limitation and struggle against it. Infinite intelligence does not encounter a problem and search desperately for a solution. It operates from the level where the solution already exists, where wholeness is the only reality, where what appears as lack from the lower level is simply an incomplete expression of an already complete pattern. And you have access to that level right now, not someday. Right now. The only thing keeping you from it is the habit of thinking from evidence, the habit of letting what you see determine what you believe, the habit of waiting for the outer world to change before you allow your inner world to settle into certainty. Murphy was very specific about this habit and why it is so destructive. He said that when you think from your senses, when you allow the evidence of your physical circumstances to be your point of departure for all inner activity, you are putting the cart before the horse. You are making effect the cause. You are looking at the shadow and treating it as the original thing. And then you are confused when the shadow doesn't change, not realizing that the only thing with the power to change the shadow is the light source casting it. Your consciousness is the light source. Your assumptions are the light. And everything you experience in the outer world, every condition, every circumstance, every limitation that seems to block you is simply the shadow your assumptions are casting. Change the assumptions and the shadow must change. Not might change, must change, because that is not philosophy, that is mechanics. Now let me give you the 4 principles Murphy returned to again and again throughout his work, because these are the actual architecture of thinking like God. The first principle is this: infinite intelligence within you already knows the answer. Every desire you carry, whether it is the desire for health, for abundance, for meaningful work, for love, for peace, that desire exists because the fulfillment of that desire already exists as a pattern in infinite intelligence. Murphy taught that desire is not random. Desire is the signal that something is possible for you, specifically for you in your life, through your unique expression. The desire and its fulfillment are 2 aspects of the same thing. They arise together. You do not desire what is impossible for you. You desire what is already present in the deeper dimension of your being, waiting for you to align your conscious awareness with it. So the first practice of thinking like God is to stop treating your desires as requests you're sending upward to some distant power and start treating them as recognitions of what already is within you. The second principle: the subconscious mind cannot distinguish between an imagined reality and a physical one. Murphy hammered this point relentlessly because it is the key that unlocks everything. When you impress your subconscious with a scene, a feeling, a state of consciousness, it accepts that impression as real. It does not compare it against the outer world and say, well, this doesn't match what his bank account shows, so I'll discard it. It accepts, it files, it begins working to externalize that impression. This is not mysticism. This is how the mind functions, and it means that you have right now, in this moment, complete access to the creative power of your subconscious simply by controlling what you feed it. Feed it the feeling of limitation, and it produces limitation. Feed it the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and it produces fulfillment. The choice sounds simple, and it is simple. Simple does not mean easy, but it is simple. The third principle: the conscious mind is the watchman at the gate. Murphy used this image constantly, the watchman at the gate, because it captures something essential. Your conscious mind is the gatekeeper between the outer world and the subconscious. It is the filter. It is the selector. And most people have left that gate completely unguarded. They have allowed every fear, every doubt, every negative suggestion from the outer world, every headline, every criticism, every memory of past failure to walk straight through the gate and impress itself upon the subconscious. And then they are confused by what the subconscious produces. Thinking like God means becoming a conscious watchman. It means taking deliberate responsibility for what you allow through that gate. It means that when fear presents itself, you do not automatically let it through. You pause, you examine it, You ask, is this what I choose to impress upon my subconscious? And if the answer is no, you replace it, not by fighting the fear, but by immediately substituting the state of the wish fulfilled. You do not argue with darkness. You turn on the light, the fourth principle. What you accept in consciousness, you will experience in form. Murphy was absolute about this. He would not soften it or make it comfortable. He said it plainly. Your world is the outpicturing of your inner assumptions. Not some of it, all of it. Every condition you find yourself in is the externalized form of a previously held inner state. This is not about blame. Murphy was always clear that this teaching is about liberation, not self-punishment. The moment you truly understand that your consciousness is cause and your circumstances are effect, you stop being a victim of your life and become the author of it. You stop waiting for conditions to change and start changing the only thing that has ever had the power to change conditions, which is the assumption you are living from right now. Let me tell you about a woman who came to understand this. She had been carrying a belief for so long she had stopped recognizing it as a belief. She thought it was just reality. The belief was this: the things she truly wanted were for other people, not for her. She could not have told you where that belief came from. Perhaps a childhood of watching her desires go unmet. Perhaps words spoken in anger by someone who should have known better. Perhaps just the slow accumulation of disappointment that eventually becomes a worldview. She had achieved things. She was not without success, but there was always a ceiling. Whenever she approached the level of the life she actually wanted, something would pull her back. A decision that seemed logical in the moment, but led nowhere. An opportunity she could not quite bring herself to take. A relationship that promised depth and then went shallow. When she encountered Murphy's teaching and sat with it long enough to let it past her defenses, she realized the ceiling was not in her circumstances. It was in her assumptions. She had been living from the assumption that the things she most deeply wanted were not available to her. And so her subconscious, faithful and precise as it always is, had been building a life that confirmed that assumption at every turn. She did not change her circumstances first. She changed her assumption. She began, every night before sleep, to inhabit the feeling of a woman for whom the life she wanted was simply her life, not a wish, not a goal, just her life, her normal, ordinary, everyday life. She held that feeling without grasping at it. She let it become familiar. She let it become the assumption she woke up inside of rather than the dream she was reaching toward. And within months, the ceiling was gone. Not because the world had decided to be kinder to her, because she had stopped instructing her subconscious to build one. This is the practice Murphy was always pointing toward, and it requires something that most people underestimate how difficult it is to do. It requires you to feel the truth of your desire before you have any evidence for it. It requires you to live, even for just a few minutes each day, in the inner atmosphere of its fulfillment. To let your body know what that freedom feels like, what that wholeness feels like, what it feels like to wake up in a life that is not constrained by the limitations you have been carrying. Not as a visualization exercise, not as a technique you perform, as a genuine inhabiting of a state, as a real, felt experience of a different assumption. Murphy called the period between the assumption and the manifestation the bridge of incidents. And he was clear that you do not need to know what that bridge looks like. You do not need to plan it, engineer it, or figure out how the assumption is going to become form. That is not your work. Your work is the assumption. The bridge builds itself. The subconscious knows paths your conscious mind has not imagined. Infinite intelligence has access to resources, connections, timing, and circumstances that your planning mind cannot see from where it stands. Your job is not to be clever. Your job is to be clear. Clear in your assumption. Clear in the feeling you are impressing upon your subconscious. Clear about the state of consciousness you are choosing to live from. The moment you are clear, everything else begins to move. Here is what Joseph Murphy would say to you if he were in this room right now. He would say that every limitation you have ever experienced has been a limitation of assumption, not a limitation of reality. Reality, true reality. The reality of infinite intelligence knows no limitation. It is only your perception of yourself, your deep unexamined beliefs about what you are and what is available to you, that creates the experience of limitation. And perception can change, assumptions can change, beliefs can change, not through years of difficult inner work, not through suffering or sacrifice or earning your way to a better story, but through a single deliberate choice to begin living from a different assumption today. He would tell you that your subconscious is not your enemy. It is not conspiring to keep you small. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to build into form whatever you consistently impress upon it. It has been building the life that matched your assumptions with perfect faithfulness. And the moment you change the impression, it will build the new life with that same faithfulness. It has no preference. It has no agenda. It is simply the most powerful creative force available to a human being, waiting for you to use it consciously instead of by default. He would tell you that thinking like God is not arrogance. It is not hubris. It is not claiming to be something you are not. It is claiming what you actually are. It is recognizing that the infinite intelligence Murphy wrote about is not somewhere outside you. It is the deeper layer of your own mind. It is what you are made of. And when you think from that recognition, when you let your assumptions arise from that level rather than from the fearful, evidence-dependent surface of a mind that has been trained to expect less than it deserves, there is no limitation that can hold. Not the limitation of your past. Not the limitation of your circumstances. Not the limitation of what seems possible from where you currently stand. Tonight, before you sleep, do one thing. Take the desire you have been carrying, the one you have almost stopped believing in because the evidence has been so long against it, and let yourself feel it as already done. Not with force, not with manufactured excitement, just with the quiet, settled feeling of someone who knows. Hold that feeling as you drift towards sleep. Let it be the last conscious impression you give to your subconscious. And do it again tomorrow night, and the night after. Not because you need to convince yourself, but because you are choosing, deliberately and consciously, to change the instruction you are giving the most powerful creative force you have ever had access to. Murphy's entire life's work comes down to this. You are not limited by the world. You are limited by what you accept about yourself within it. Change the acceptance and you change the world, because the world you experience has never been anything other than the mirror of your deepest assumptions made visible. It is already done in consciousness. It has always been done in consciousness. The only question is whether you are willing to live from that truth before the evidence arrives. That willingness, that single act of inner courage, is what Murphy called thinking like God, and it is available to you right now, completely, without qualification, without condition, without a single thing needing to change in your outer world first. The shift is always inward. The results are always outward, and the law never fails. Because here is what most people do not realize about the moment they first encounter this teaching. They hear it. They feel something stir inside them, something deep and quiet and almost forgotten, a recognition not of something new, but of something true they have always known and somehow allowed to get buried beneath years of evidence to the contrary. And then they go back to their lives. They go back to the inbox and the bills and the conversation that did not go the way they hoped and the body that does not feel the way they want it to feel. And within 48 hours the feeling is gone. The recognition fades, and they are back in the familiar room of their old assumptions, wondering if what they felt for that brief moment was real or just another beautiful idea that does not actually survive contact with ordinary life. This is the moment Murphy was most concerned about, not the moment of first understanding, the moment of return. The moment when the old world rushes back in and the new assumption has not yet hardened into enough visible form to give the conscious mind something to hold on to. He called this the testing period, and he said it plainly. Almost everyone who fails with this teaching fails not because the teaching is wrong, and not because they are incapable of applying it. They fail because they do not persist through the testing period. They plant the seed, and then they dig it up 3 days later to see if it is growing. And every time you dig up the seed, you interrupt the process. Every time you return to the old assumption, because the new one has not yet produced visible results, you reset the creative cycle. You send your subconscious a contradictory instruction. You say in the morning, I am whole and abundant and free, and I know this is already done. And then by evening, when nothing has visibly shifted, you say, see, I knew it wasn't real. And the subconscious, which does not judge, which does not take sides, which simply builds what it is most consistently given, quietly sets aside the morning instruction and returns to building from the evening one. This is why Murphy spoke so often about persistence not as a virtue, but as a technical requirement. It is not that the universe rewards the patient. It is that the subconscious requires a consistent, dominant impression before it reorganizes the conditions of your life to match it. Think about how long you have been impressing your subconscious with the old assumption. For some people it has been decades, the belief that they are not quite enough, that security is always slightly out of reach, that love is conditional or fragile or reserved for people with some quality they lack, that their body is unreliable, that their best years are behind them. These assumptions have been impressed and reinforced and deepened over years, sometimes over an entire lifetime, and you expect a week of bedtime prayers to override all of that. You expect 3 days of feeling the wish fulfilled to completely restructure a subconscious that has been running the old program for 30 years. And when it does not happen in 3 days, you conclude the teaching does not work. Murphy would sit with you in that frustration, and he would say something that might surprise you. He would say, you are actually very close. He would say that the frustration itself, the impatience, the desperate wanting to see evidence, is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are right at the threshold. It is the feeling of the old assumption fighting for its survival. Because assumptions, like all patterns, have a kind of momentum. They resist replacement. Not because they are powerful in themselves, but because they have been given power through repetition and through the emotional charge of years of lived experience. And the moment you begin consistently impressing a new assumption, the old one creates noise. It generates doubt. It points to evidence. It recruits your past as a witness against your future. And most people, hearing that noise, conclude that the new assumption is false rather than recognizing that the noise is simply the sound of the old pattern losing its grip. So let me give you something practical for this exact moment. Because Murphy was never satisfied with teaching that stayed theoretical, he always brought it back to something you could do tonight in the specific circumstances of your actual life. When the old assumption rushes back in, when the evidence piles up and the doubt speaks loudly and the logical mind presents its case for why your desire is unrealistic, do not fight it. Do not argue with it. Do not try to reason your way out of fear with more thinking. Murphy was clear about this because he understood that the conscious mind cannot defeat itself through its own effort. You cannot think your way out of a limiting assumption using the same level of mind that the assumption lives on. You have to go deeper. You have to go beneath the argument. The way you do that is through what Murphy called the controlled reverie. It is simpler than it sounds. It is the deliberate entering of a relaxed, drowsy, half-aware state, the state that lives at the border between waking and sleep. And in that state, feeding the subconscious a single clear scene, a single clear feeling, a single clear sense of the wish already fulfilled. Not a long visualization. Not a complicated mental movie, just one moment, one image, one feeling, the feeling of relief, the feeling of arrival, the feeling of a person who has come home to the life they always knew was theirs. Hold it for 30 seconds. Hold it for a minute. Let it feel real in the body. Let the nervous system register it as an actual experience, and then let it go. Do not grasp at it. Do not try to hold it permanently. Just impress it cleanly and release it the way you would drop a letter in a mailbox. Your job ends at the mailbox. The delivery is not your responsibility. Do this once in the morning in those first soft minutes before you are fully awake, when the conscious mind has not yet fully engaged its editorial function. Do it again at night as you drift towards sleep. And whenever during the day you catch the old assumption running, whenever you hear yourself narrating limitation, stop not with force but with gentleness and return to the feeling, not the words, the feeling. Because the subconscious does not speak in sentences. It speaks in states. It speaks in the felt sense of things. And the felt sense of the wish fulfilled, consistently returned to, consistently reinforced, consistently chosen as your dominant inner atmosphere, will in time, and usually in less time than you expect, begin to appear in your outer world as changed conditions, as opened doors, as unexpected conversations, as the sudden availability of something that seemed completely inaccessible the week before. Murphy documented case after case of this in his work, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he understood that the human mind needs evidence before it will truly commit to a new way of operating. He wrote about a man who had been unemployed for over a year, who had applied to hundreds of positions and received nothing but silence or rejection. This man did not lack skill. He did not lack experience. What he lacked was a subconscious impression that matched the outcome he wanted. Because beneath the surface of his applications and his interviews, beneath the professional presentation he put forward to the world, his dominant inner assumption was one of rejection. He expected to be turned down, not consciously, not deliberately, but in that deep wordless place where assumptions live, he had accepted rejection as his likely outcome. And the subconscious, faithful to its instructions, kept producing that outcome with remarkable consistency. Murphy worked with him not on his resume or his interview technique, but on his inner state. He asked him every night to construct a single scene in his imagination. Not the process of getting a job, not the interview going well or the phone call offering the position, just the end result. The feeling of being already established in work that was right for him. The feeling of competence and contribution and financial ease. The feeling of a man who was not searching anymore because the searching was over. He held that scene every night for 3 weeks. And on the 22nd day he received a call from a company he had contacted 8 months earlier and forgotten about entirely. They had kept his information. A position had opened. Could he come in? He went in. He was hired. Not because he had become more qualified in 3 weeks. Because he had become different inside. Because the assumption he was broadcasting had changed. And the world, which is always listening, which is always reflecting, had no choice but to change with it. This is the mechanics Murphy was always describing. And the more you sit with it, the more you realize it is not complicated. It is actually the simplest thing in the world. The world reflects your assumptions. Change your assumptions and the world changes. Everything else, every technique, every prayer, every affirmation, every bedtime exercise is simply a method for changing the assumption. That is all it is. And any method that successfully changes the dominant assumption will work. Any method that fails to change the dominant assumption will not work regardless of how sincerely it is practiced or how perfectly the technique is executed. The technique is never the point. The assumption is always the point. Now Murphy also taught something that most of his interpreters quietly skip past because it is the most challenging part of his entire body of work. He taught that other people in your life, the people who seem to be doing things to you, the people who seem to be blocking you or betraying you or withholding from you, are not independent agents acting upon your life from outside your consciousness. They are, in a profound and precise sense, reflections of your own inner state. They are showing you your assumptions made visible in human form. The employer who does not value you is showing you an assumption that you are not fully valuable. The partner who is unavailable is showing you an assumption that deep connection is not really available to you. The friend who consistently lets you down is showing you an assumption about what you can expect from people. Murphy was not saying this to add to your burden. He was not saying this to give you one more thing to feel responsible for. He was saying it Because it is the most liberating truth in the entire teaching. Because if other people are reflections of your assumptions, then you do not have to change other people. You do not have to wait for them to be different. You do not have to hope they will finally see you clearly or treat you right or show up the way you need them to. You simply have to change the assumption. You have to begin living from the inner state of someone who is valued, someone who is deeply loved, someone who is surrounded by people who are reliable and generous and supportive. And as that assumption deepens, as it becomes your dominant inner atmosphere, the people in your life will shift. Some will change in the way they relate to you. Some will leave and be replaced by people who naturally match the new assumption. The mirror always updates to reflect the new face you bring to it. This is what Murphy meant when he said you are not in the world is in you, not poetically. Literally, the world you experience, the texture of your daily reality, the quality of your relationships, the flow of resources through your life, the state of your health, the sense of possibility or limitation that colors every morning when you wake up, all of it is taking place within consciousness. All of it is the subconscious making visible what it has been most consistently given to work with. Which means the leverage point is never out there. It is always in here. It is always the assumption. It is always the dominant inner state. It is always what you are choosing, consciously or by default, to accept as true about yourself and about what is possible for you in this life. Joseph Murphy spent decades watching people transform their lives with this understanding. Not over years of gradual incremental improvement, sometimes in weeks, sometimes in days, because when the assumption genuinely changes, when the subconscious receives a new dominant impression with enough emotional reality to override the old one, the outer world does not wait politely for the next quarter. It begins reorganizing immediately. The invisible roots begin growing the moment the seed is planted, and the bridge of incidents, the sequence of events and encounters and opportunities that will carry the assumption into visible form, begins constructing itself from the very moment the new inner state becomes real. So here is what Murphy is asking of you. Not belief, not blind faith, not the suppression of doubt or the performance of certainty you do not yet feel. He is asking for an experiment, a genuine, committed, 30-day experiment in which you choose one desire, just one, and you give your subconscious a consistent, dominant impression of that desire already fulfilled. Every morning in those soft waking minutes, every night as you drift toward sleep, every time during the day you catch the old assumption running, you return to the feeling, not the words, the feeling. The settled inner atmosphere of someone for whom this desire is simply their life, and you persist. Not because you have convinced yourself it is working, but because you understand the law, because you understand that the subconscious is always building from the dominant impression. And you are choosing, deliberately and consciously, to make the new assumption the dominant one. Do this for 30 days. Not perfectly. Not without moments of doubt or slipping back into the old patterns. Just consistently enough that the new impression outweighs the old one over the course of the month. And then watch what happens, not with desperate scrutiny looking for signs that it is working, with the relaxed certainty of the gardener who has planted the seed and trusts the process, with the quiet knowing of the architect who has drawn the blueprint and understands that the structure is already complete in the only dimension where anything is ever first complete, which is consciousness. Because Murphy's final and deepest teaching is this: you have never actually been limited. The infinite intelligence that created this universe and sustains it in every moment is the same intelligence that lives at the deepest level of your own mind. It has been there the entire time, patient, available, completely capable of producing any outcome you can genuinely assume as your own. The only thing that has ever stood between you and the life you most deeply desire is the assumption that it was not available to you. And now you know that assumption was never the truth. It was just a habit, a deeply worn groove in the subconscious cut by years of repetition. And habits can change, grooves can be replaced, assumptions can be rewritten, Right now, tonight, in the quiet of your own mind before you sleep, think like God means this. Think from wholeness. Think from the end. Think from the assumption that what you desire is not something you are trying to get, but something you are simply allowing yourself to know is already yours in the deeper reality of consciousness. Let that be your dominant state. Let that be the instruction you give the most powerful creative force in your experience. And then trust the law, not because someone told you to, because you have understood it now in a way that goes past the intellect. You have felt it. And what you have felt at that level does not leave you. It becomes the new foundation. It becomes the new place you think from. And from that place, the life Joseph Murphy was always pointing you toward is not a hope. It is simply a matter of time, and the time is always shorter than you fear. 1:40 a.m. And yet time itself is something Murphy wanted you to reconsider entirely. Because one of the deepest traps the conscious mind falls into is the trap of measuring progress by the clock. You assume on Monday and by Wednesday you are checking the outer world for evidence. You feel the wish fulfilled on Tuesday night, and by Thursday morning you are calculating how many days have passed without visible change. And in that calculating, in that measuring, in that constant surveillance of the outer world for signs that the inner work is producing results, you are doing something that Murphy identified as the single most common way people undermine the entire process. You are thinking from time, and the infinite intelligence you are trying to align with does not think from time at all. This sounds abstract until you feel what it actually means in practice. When you check for results, you are operating from the assumption that the thing is not yet here. You are looking for it, which means you have accepted its absence as your current reality. And your subconscious, which is always listening, which is always taking its instruction from your dominant felt assumption, hears that acceptance of absence and continues building from it. The very act of looking for evidence that your assumption is working is itself an expression of the assumption that it might not be. And that is the instruction that goes deepest, not the hopeful bedtime prayer, the anxious morning audit. Murphy told his students something that initially frustrated many of them. He said the fastest way to your desire is to become genuinely indifferent to when it arrives. Not indifferent to whether it arrives. That would be abandoning the assumption, indifferent to when. Because indifference to timing is the felt experience of certainty. When you truly know something is done, you do not pace and check and calculate. You simply live. You go about your day from the inner atmosphere of someone whose desire is already secured in consciousness and whose only remaining relationship to the outer world is one of relaxed expectation rather than anxious surveillance. The farmer does not dig up the field every morning to measure root growth. He tends the soil, he stays engaged. He remains oriented toward the harvest. But he does not panic at the absence of the sprout on day 4 because he understands that visible absence does not mean nothing is happening. It means the most important work is happening where he cannot see it. This is the posture Murphy was always cultivating in the people he worked with. A posture of engaged certainty, active but not anxious, oriented toward the outcome but not white-knuckling the timeline. Fully committed to the assumption but not desperate for it to prove itself by Friday. Because desperation is the emotional signature of lack, and lack is the instruction you cannot afford to keep sending to the subconscious while simultaneously trying to impress it with abundance. The two signals cancel each other, and what remains is the confusion and inconsistency that most people experience when they first begin working with these principles. Glimpses of something shifting followed by collapse back into the old pattern. Moments of genuine feeling followed by days of doubt. Progress that seems to evaporate just when it was beginning to feel real. Murphy was compassionate about this, but he was also direct. He said the confusion is not evidence that the law is inconsistent. The law is perfectly consistent. The confusion is evidence that the practitioner is inconsistent, that the dominant assumption is still shifting between the old and the new rather than having genuinely settled into the new. And the solution is not to try harder. It is not to perform the technique more intensely or more frequently. The solution is to go deeper into the feeling, to make the inner state more real, to spend more time actually inhabiting the consciousness of the wish fulfilled rather than thinking about the concept of inhabiting it. Because thinking about the state is not the same as being in the state. And only the state impresses the subconscious. Only the felt reality of the assumption penetrates to the level where creation happens. Let me make this distinction as clear as I possibly can, because it is where almost everyone loses their way. There is a difference between understanding this teaching intellectually and actually living from it. The intellectual understanding is valuable. It is the beginning. It is what brings you to the threshold. But intellectual understanding alone will not change your subconscious assumptions. You can understand perfectly how swimming works and still drown if you never get in the water. You can comprehend every principle Murphy ever taught and still wake up every morning in the same limiting circumstances if that comprehension stays in the thinking mind and never becomes a felt reality in the body, in the emotional system, in the deep wordless knowing that lives beneath thought. This is why Murphy placed such emphasis on the state akin to sleep, not as a technique among other techniques, but as the primary access point to the subconscious. Because in ordinary waking consciousness, the critical mind is fully engaged. It is comparing, it is evaluating, it is measuring the new assumption against the evidence of existing conditions and finding it lacking. It is doing its job, which is to keep you safe within the known. But in the drowsy, half-aware state that lives at the threshold of sleep, that critical function quiets. The guard steps away from the gate. And in that moment the subconscious is directly accessible. Whatever you impress upon it in that state, with genuine feeling, with the sensory reality of the wish already fulfilled, goes in without resistance. It goes in the way a seed goes into prepared soil, cleanly, completely, with nothing in the way. Murphy said, if you do nothing else, do this. Every night as you feel sleep approaching, hold one image, hear one phrase, feel one feeling that belongs to the life you are claiming. Make it specific enough to be real, but simple enough to hold without effort. The feeling of a particular chair in a particular room in the home you desire. The sound of a particular conversation in which someone congratulates you on the thing you have been working toward. The physical sensation of ease in a body that has returned to health. One clear impression, held with genuine feeling. Released into sleep and trusted to the infinite intelligence that needs no further instruction once it has received a clear one. He documented a woman who healed a condition her doctors had declared permanent, using nothing more than this practice done faithfully every night for 6 weeks. Every night she held the feeling of perfect health in her body. Not the image of health, the feeling of it. The actual physical sensation of vitality and ease, and the deep cellular knowing that her body was whole. She did not fight the diagnosis. She did not spend her days angrily denying the condition existed. She simply gave her subconscious a consistent nightly impression of its opposite. And at the end of 6 weeks her doctors could not explain what they were looking at. Murphy did not call it a miracle. He called it the law operating without interference. The subconscious receiving a clear instruction and doing what it always does, which is to build that instruction into form. This is available to you, not as a story about someone else, as a lived reality in your own experience. But it requires something that is simultaneously the simplest and the most demanding thing Murphy ever asked of anyone. It requires you to take your imagination seriously, to treat it not as a pleasant escape from reality, but as the actual creative instrument through which reality is made. Most people have been taught their entire lives that imagination is the opposite of reality, that what is real is what you can touch and measure and verify with the senses, and that what you imagine is by definition not real, unsubstantiated, wishful, childish even, and so they have spent their lives giving all of their creative power to the outer world, reacting to it, being shaped by it, allowing it to determine their assumptions and therefore their experience. And they have used their imagination, when they use it at all, primarily to extend and elaborate the fears and limitations they are already experiencing. Worrying is imagination. Rehearsing failure is imagination. Expecting the worst is imagination. They have been using the most powerful creative instrument available to them to build more of what they do not want, and they have called that being realistic. Murphy wanted to turn that completely around. He wanted you to understand that imagination used deliberately, used with emotional conviction, used from the assumption of the wish already fulfilled, is not escapism. It is the most fundamentally realistic thing you can do, because it is working at the level of cause rather than the level of effect. It is going to the place where conditions are actually created rather than spending all of your energy rearranging conditions after they have already formed. It is being a conscious participant in your own creation rather than an unconscious product of whatever assumptions you happened to absorb from your environment. It is, in the most precise sense Murphy knew how to express it, thinking like God, operating from the level where the outcome is already established, where the blueprint is already complete, where the infinite intelligence that has no concept of impossibility is already moving to externalize what has been impressed upon it. And there is one more dimension of this teaching that Murphy returned to near the end of his life with particular urgency. He had watched thousands of people transform their circumstances using these principles. He had seen healings that medicine could not account for, prosperities that emerged from apparent ruin, relationships restored after years of fracture, opportunities that appeared from directions no one had anticipated. And through all of it he kept returning to a question that he felt most people were not asking deeply enough. Not just what do I want to manifest, but who do I want to become in the process? Because Murphy understood that every assumption you persist in does not just create external conditions. It reshapes you. It literally changes the kind of person you are. The consciousness you inhabit most consistently becomes your character. The inner state you return to most habitually becomes your identity. And this means that the practice of thinking like God, of consistently choosing to assume from wholeness rather than from lack, from certainty rather than from fear, from the fulfilled end rather than the anxious middle, is not just a method for getting things. It is a path of becoming. It is the gradual transformation of the entire quality of your being, not through discipline and self-denial, not through the suppression of your desires, but through the consistent elevation of the level from which you think, feel, and move through the world. Murphy had seen people get what they wanted and find it hollow because they had gotten it while remaining fundamentally the same inside. The money arrived, but the fear of losing it arrived with it because the assumption beneath the surface had never really changed. The relationship materialized, but the feeling of unworthiness showed up inside it because the deeper belief about what they deserved had not been addressed. He saw this enough times that he began emphasizing something beyond the techniques. He began emphasizing the importance of genuinely inhabiting the new identity. Not just wanting the conditions of a different life, but actually becoming the person for whom those conditions are natural. Allowing the consistent practice of the elevated assumption to change not just your circumstances, but your entire felt sense of who you are and what this life is. Because here is the truth that sits at the very center of everything Joseph Murphy ever taught. You are not a fixed thing trying to get better conditions. You are a consciousness with the capacity to operate at any level you choose to consistently inhabit. And the level you inhabit determines everything. It determines what you attract, what you notice, what you believe is meant for you, what you allow yourself to receive, what you unconsciously push away before it can fully arrive. Everything flows from the level of consciousness you are living from, and you can change that level, not in years. In the quiet of a single evening when you finally stop arguing with the possibility and simply let yourself feel, even for one unguarded moment, what it would be like to actually be the person you have been trying to become. That moment, that single genuine felt experience of a different assumption, is the beginning of a different life. Murphy knew this. He had seen it too many times to doubt it. He had watched the most unlikely people in the most difficult circumstances make that inner shift and watched their worlds begin to reorganize around it with a precision that never ceased to move him. And he spent his life trying to make that shift as accessible as possible, trying to strip away the mystery and the mysticism and the unnecessary complexity and hand people the simplest, most direct path he knew to the most powerful thing available to a human being, which is the conscious, deliberate use of their own imagination in alignment with infinite intelligence. That is the inheritance he left. Not a system, not a religion, not a set of rules to follow or rituals to perform. A way of being, a way of thinking, a way of moving through this world from the inside out rather than the outside in. From assumption rather than reaction. From the end rather than the middle. From the knowing of infinite intelligence rather than the fear of the limited self. And that way of being is available to you right now. In this moment. In whatever circumstances you find yourself in whatever degree of lack or confusion or limitation you are currently experiencing. The door is not locked. It has never been locked. It has always opened from the inside, and the handle has always been exactly where Murphy said it was. In the feeling, in the assumption, in the quiet, deliberate choice to think from wholeness rather than from lack, to think from the end rather than the middle, to think as Joseph Murphy spent his entire life inviting you to think like God. It is done the moment you assume it is done. The rest is simply the world catching up to what consciousness has already decided, and it always catches up, without exception, without failure, without a single case in the entire record of human experience where a genuinely held consistent dominant assumption of wholeness and fulfillment did not eventually make itself visible in form. The law does not take days off. It does not play favorites. It does not reward the educated or the spiritually advanced or the naturally gifted. It responds to the assumption. Only the assumption. Always the assumption. So assume well. Assume from the deepest level you can reach. Assume from that quiet place before sleep where the critical mind goes still and the subconscious listens with complete openness. Assume from the morning softness before the day has had a chance to reassert its old claims on your attention. Assume in the middle of difficulty, not as a denial of the difficulty, but as a declaration that consciousness is always greater than any condition it has produced. And persist, not perfectly, just consistently, just enough that over time the new assumption becomes the dominant one, and the dominant one always wins. That is not hope. That is mechanics. That is Joseph Murphy's gift to you, and it is yours completely, right now, without condition, without qualification. Without a single thing needing to be different before you begin. Begin now. The infinite intelligence is listening. It has always been listening. And it has never once failed to build exactly what it was given to build. And what it builds from the inside out, always. Without exception. This is the part of Murphy's teaching that requires the longest sitting with because it runs so completely contrary to everything the modern world teaches about how change happens. The world says change your actions and your life will change. Work harder, be smarter, network better, optimize your habits, build better systems, and eventually the outer conditions will shift. And Murphy did not say action is irrelevant. He never taught passivity. He never suggested you sit in a chair feeling abundant while ignoring every practical dimension of your life. What he said was something far more precise and far more radical than either extreme. He said the quality of your actions is determined entirely by the state of consciousness from which they arise. And the state of consciousness from which they arise is determined entirely by your dominant assumption, which means the sequence is never action first. It is always assumption first, state first, inner atmosphere first, and then action arising naturally and inevitably from that state, carrying with it the creative power of the level of consciousness it came from. Think about what this means practically. Two people can take identical actions and produce completely different results. The same resume sent from a consciousness of genuine confidence and settled self-worth produces different outcomes than the same resume sent from a consciousness of quiet desperation and the assumption of likely rejection. The same business conversation conducted from the inner state of someone who knows the value they bring produces different results than the same conversation conducted from the inner state of someone who is hoping the other person will not notice their inadequacy. The same investment made from abundance consciousness produces different outcomes than the same investment made from scarcity consciousness. Not because the universe is rewarding one emotional state and punishing another, but because the state you are in shapes every micro-decision, every subtle choice of words, every unconscious signal you broadcast, every opportunity you notice or fail to notice, every door you walk through or walk past. The state does not just feel different, it literally produces different behavior, different perception, different results. And Murphy wanted you to understand that trying to change your behavior without first changing your state is like trying to change the reflection without changing the face. You can manage it for a moment. You can perform a different behavior for a short time through sheer effort of will. But without the changed inner state beneath it, the behavior reverts. The old pattern reasserts. The reflection snaps back to match the face that was never actually changed. This is why so much self-improvement work produces temporary results. People change their behavior through discipline and structure and accountability, and for a while it works. The new habit holds. The new pattern produces new results, and then life applies pressure. Stress increases, circumstances push back. And without the changed assumption beneath the behavior, the whole structure collapses. Because behavior maintained by willpower alone is always vulnerable to the moment willpower runs out. But behavior that arises naturally from a changed assumption, from a genuinely different inner state, does not require willpower at all. It is simply the natural expression of who you have become inside. It is effortless in the deepest sense of that word. Not that it requires no energy, but that it requires no resistance to yourself, no constant internal argument between what you are trying to do and what some deeper part of you actually believes is true. Murphy worked with a man once who had been trying to lose weight for 15 years. He had tried every program, every diet, every exercise regimen available to him. And every time he would make progress for a few months, and then something would happen, and he would return to exactly where he started, sometimes further back. And he came to Murphy exhausted and ashamed and convinced there was something fundamentally broken in his willpower. And Murphy listened to everything he said about the diets and the programs and the failures. And then he asked him one question. He said, "When you imagine yourself at the weight and health you want, how does it feel?" And the man thought about it and said, "It feels foreign. It feels like I am imagining someone else. It does not feel like me." And Murphy said that is the entire problem. Not your willpower, not your discipline, not your commitment. The problem is that your subconscious has a very clear and well-established impression of who you are physically. And every time you try to produce a result that contradicts that impression through surface-level behavior change, the subconscious eventually corrects back to the impression it holds. Because the subconscious is always trying to produce consistency between your inner image of yourself and your outer experience of yourself. It is not sabotaging you. It is being faithful to the instruction it was given. So Murphy did not give him another program. He gave him an instruction for his imagination. Every night before sleep, he was to hold the feeling of being already in the body he wanted. Not the image of it, the feeling of it. The physical sensation of moving through the world in a body that was healthy and energetic and exactly as he wanted it to be. The feeling of putting on clothes that fit perfectly. The feeling of walking up a flight of stairs without effort. The feeling of looking in the mirror and recognizing the reflection as himself. Not as a stranger, as himself. He was to hold that feeling until it began to feel familiar, until it began to feel like him. Until the subconscious started receiving a new impression of who he was physically. And as that impression deepened and strengthened and became the dominant one, the behaviors would follow. Not through willpower, through natural alignment between the new inner image and the desire to express it outwardly. Within 4 months, he had released more weight than in any previous attempt. And he reported something that surprised him more than the physical change. He said the choices became easy. He said he stopped craving the things that had always derailed him before. Not because he was suppressing the cravings through discipline, because the cravings genuinely diminished. Because the inner image had changed and the body was simply aligning with the new image. This is the mechanics Murphy was always pointing to. Change the impression and the expression changes. Change the assumption and the behavior changes. Change the inner image and the outer form reorganizes to match it. Every time, without fail. Now Murphy also taught something about this process that is particularly relevant to anyone who has been carrying a long history of failure in a particular area of life. He taught about what he called the accumulated weight of contradictory evidence. And he addressed it directly because he understood that, for some people, the challenge is not just changing the assumption going forward. It is dealing with the emotional residue of years of evidence that seems to confirm the limiting assumption as true. The person who has failed financially for 20 years does not just need to assume abundance. They are also carrying 20 years of memories that their subconscious has filed as proof that lack is their reality. The person who has experienced repeated relationship failure does not just need to assume love. They are also navigating a subconscious archive of rejection and disappointment that keeps presenting itself as evidence for the assumption of unworthiness. Murphy called the clearing of this archive revision, and he taught it as a distinct and essential practice separate from the forward-looking assumption work. Because you cannot fully impress a new assumption while the old one is continuously being reinforced by unresolved emotional memories. The past does not stay in the past. Energetically, emotionally, it is present. Every unhealed memory, every unresolved wound, every experience that confirmed your limitations is still broadcasting from the subconscious and still contributing to your dominant inner state. Which means that revision, the deliberate imaginative rewriting of past experiences that still carry emotional charge, is not optional for most people. It is a necessary part of changing the dominant assumption completely enough to produce lasting change. The practice is this. You identify a memory that still triggers a strong emotional response when you encounter it. Not to dwell in the pain of it, not to analyze it or understand it psychologically, but to revise it. In your imagination, you go back to that scene and you rewrite it. You see it ending differently. You hear different words spoken. You feel a different outcome. You do this with as much sensory specificity as you can. You make the revised version as emotionally real as the original. And you repeat it until the revised version becomes the version your subconscious reaches for first when that period of your life comes to mind. Until the emotional charge of the original has been replaced by the emotional reality of the revision. Murphy was clear that you are not lying to yourself when you do this. You are not denying that something painful happened. You are doing something far more sophisticated. You are removing the power that memory has over your current creative output. You are changing what that experience has been instructing your subconscious about who you are and what you deserve and what is possible for you. Because the memory was never just a memory. It was an ongoing instruction, and you have the right and the ability to change the instruction. The event is fixed in linear time, but its meaning, its emotional imprint, its effect on your current assumptions is completely within your power to revise. A woman came to Murphy carrying a memory from early childhood. She had been publicly humiliated in a classroom when she gave a wrong answer, and the teacher had laughed along with the other children. She was 7 years old, and for 40 years that memory had been quietly running in the background of every situation in which she might be seen and judged. Every time she had something valuable to contribute in a professional setting, she felt the ghost of that classroom. The flush of shame, the assumption that if she spoke she would be humiliated. And so she had spent 4 decades holding back, staying small, letting her insights and intelligence and genuine gifts go unexpressed because a 7-year-old girl in a classroom had decided it was safer to be silent. Murphy asked her to revise the memory, to go back to that classroom in her imagination and rewrite what happened, to see the teacher respond to her answer with genuine interest, to hear encouragement instead of laughter, to feel the sensation of being seen and valued rather than shamed. She did this every night for 3 weeks. And the shift was not just emotional. Within a month, she gave a presentation at work that her colleagues described as one of the most insightful they had ever heard. She had not taken a public speaking course. She had not worked with a coach on her confidence. She had simply removed the 40-year-old instruction that had been telling her subconscious that visibility led to humiliation. And in the absence of that instruction, the natural intelligence and articulateness she had always possessed simply expressed itself, freely, fully, as it had always wanted to. This is the complete picture of what Murphy was teaching. It is not just forward-looking assumption work. It is also the clearing of the past impressions that contradict the new assumption. It is both the planting of new seeds and the removal of the weeds that would choke them before they can take root. And together, the revision of limiting past impressions combined with the consistent nightly inhabiting of the wish fulfilled. This combination is what Murphy found to be the most reliably transformative practice available to anyone regardless of their circumstances, their history, their level of education or spiritual development or natural talent. Because the law does not discriminate. It does not require you to be worthy or advanced or specially gifted. It requires only that you give the subconscious a clear, consistent, dominant impression of the reality you choose to inhabit. That is the entire requirement. Clear, consistent, dominant, felt as real, impressed with emotional conviction, and released with the trust of someone who understands that the infinite intelligence receiving that impression is not indifferent to it. It is actively, immediately, completely committed to externalizing it, because that is what infinite intelligence does. That is its nature. It creates, it expresses, it externalizes, and it externalizes precisely what it is given, without judgment, without preference, without any capacity to withhold from you what you have genuinely and consistently impressed upon it. Murphy's final words on this, the words he returned to most often in the last years of his life, were these: "Your subconscious is your most faithful servant and your most powerful ally. It has never worked against you. It has always worked faithfully for you, building with perfect precision exactly what you gave it to build. The only error was never in the subconscious. The only error was always in the impression. Give it a new impression, a clear one, a felt one, a consistent one, and watch it build the new life with the same perfect faithfulness with which it built the old one." That is the promise, not of a man, of a law. And the law has never once broken its promise to anyone who met its single simple requirement. Meet the requirement. Impress the subconscious with the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Revise the past impressions that contradict it. Persist in the new assumption with the relaxed certainty of someone who understands the mechanics. And live, beginning today, beginning tonight, beginning in the quiet moment before sleep, when infinite intelligence is most available and most receptive, as the person you have chosen to become, because you have always been choosing. Every assumption you have ever lived from was a choice, even when it felt like reality, even when it felt like just the way things are. It was always an assumption you had accepted, and assumptions that were accepted can be replaced with new assumptions, chosen deliberately, impressed consistently, felt genuinely, and trusted completely to the infinite intelligence that has never needed anything more from you than a clear instruction and the willingness to stop contradicting it before it has had time to build. The building is already underway. It began the moment you first genuinely felt the truth of this. The roots are already forming beneath the surface of your current conditions. The bridge of incidents is already under construction in dimensions of reality your physical senses cannot yet perceive. The seed is in the ground. The law is at work. The infinite intelligence is building. All that remains is for you to keep watering the seed, to keep returning to the feeling, to keep choosing the new assumption over the old one every time the old one presents itself. Not forever, just until the new assumption becomes the natural one. just until thinking from wholeness feels more like home than thinking from lack. Just until the mind of God, the infinite intelligence that Murphy spent his life pointing you toward, stops feeling like something you are trying to access and starts feeling like something you simply are. Because that is where this has always been going, not to a technique, not to a practice, not even to a transformed set of outer circumstances, though those will come, they always come. It has always been going to this, to the recognition that the infinite intelligence Murphy called God is not outside you waiting to be reached. It is the deepest layer of what you are. It has been here the entire time, patient, inexhaustible, completely capable of producing any reality you are willing to consistently assume as your own. Waiting not for your perfection, not for your worthiness, not for your complete mastery of every principle he ever taught. Waiting only for your willingness to stop assuming you are separate from it, to stop living as though limitation is your nature, to stop, even for one unguarded moment before sleep tonight, treating lack as the truth about you, because it never was the truth about you. It was only ever an assumption, and assumptions can always be changed. Starting now, starting tonight, starting in the quiet where infinite intelligence listens and never fails to answer. That is the teaching. That is the gift. That is everything Joseph Murphy ever wanted you to know. There is something that happens when a person truly receives this teaching. Not when they hear it. Not when they understand it intellectually. Not when they nod along and feel the resonance of it in the moment. But when they truly receive it. When it drops below the level of thought and lands in the place where knowing lives. The place beneath opinion and analysis and the endless commentary of a mind that has been trained to evaluate everything before accepting it. When it lands there in that deep, wordless place, something shifts that cannot be unshifted. Something settles that had been restless for years, sometimes for a lifetime, and the person who walks away from that moment is not quite the same person who walked toward it, not because they have acquired new information, but because they have remembered something true about themselves that the noise of ordinary life had buried so deeply they had almost stopped believing it was there. Joseph Murphy understood this moment. He had seen it happen in the faces of the people he worked with more times than he could count. He called it the moment of acceptance, not intellectual acceptance, not the agreeing of the conscious mind with a set of propositions, the deep cellular acceptance of a truth that the subconscious recognizes as its own, the moment when the teaching stops being something you are considering and becomes something you are living from. And he said that moment, that single inner event, was worth more than years of technique, worth more than decades of disciplined practice done from the wrong level, because from that moment forward the practice was no longer effort, it was expression. It was no longer trying to become something. It was allowing what you already were to finally move without obstruction. This is what he wanted for you, not the techniques. The moment of acceptance, the settling, the recognition, the coming home to a truth that was never absent, only overlooked, only buried beneath the accumulated weight of assumptions that were never yours to begin with. Assumptions absorbed from a world that had forgotten its own nature. Assumptions inherited from people who were themselves operating from inherited assumptions. A chain of limitation passed from generation to generation not through malice, but through simple unawareness. Through the honest mistake of treating the reflection as the source. Through the deeply conditioned habit of looking outward for what can only be found inward. And Murphy wanted to break that chain. Not for a select few. Not for the spiritually gifted, or the intellectually sophisticated, or the ones who had already done enough inner work to be ready for advanced teaching. For everyone. For the person in the most ordinary circumstances, carrying the most ordinary fears, living the most ordinary life, that somehow never quite became the life they felt they were meant for. He wanted to break the chain for that person specifically, because that was the person he had been before he discovered these principles. That was the person he saw in the faces of everyone who came to him, ordinary people carrying extraordinary potential that their limiting assumptions had never allowed to fully express. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had witnessed it hundreds of times, that the potential was never the question. The assumption was always the question, and the assumption could always be changed. So let this be the moment. Not the moment you finish watching or listening or reading. The moment you actually receive it. The moment you let it land below the level of thought and settle into the place where your subconscious takes its instructions from. The moment you stop evaluating whether it is true and simply allow yourself to live as though it is. Because living as though it is true is itself the practice. It is itself the assumption. And the assumption held consistently, felt genuinely, returned to faithfully, is all the subconscious has ever needed to begin building a different life. You do not need more preparation. You do not need to understand every nuance of the teaching before you begin. You do not need to resolve every doubt or answer every objection your conscious mind is currently presenting. Murphy was always clear about this. The conscious mind will present objections indefinitely. That is its function. That is what it was designed to do. And if you wait for the conscious mind to stop objecting before you begin living from the new assumption, you will wait forever, because the conscious mind does not stop objecting based on argument. It stops objecting based on evidence, and the evidence only comes after the assumption, which means you have to begin before the evidence. You have to assume before the proof. You have to live from the end before the middle has resolved itself. That is not blind faith. That is the precise understanding of how consciousness creates. Assumption first, evidence always second. Always. Without exception, this sequence never reverses. Murphy made this the foundation of everything he taught, because he understood that most human suffering comes from the attempt to reverse it, from waiting for conditions to change before changing the assumption, from waiting for evidence before allowing belief, from waiting for the outer world to give permission for the inner world to settle into certainty. And that waiting is the trap, because the outer world is never going to give that permission. It cannot. It does not have the capacity to initiate change. It only has the capacity to reflect change, and the change it reflects always originates inward, always begins in consciousness, always starts with the assumption. Start with the assumption. That is the entire instruction. That is the distillation of every book Murphy ever wrote, every lecture he ever gave, every person he ever sat with in their pain and their confusion and their desperate wanting to understand why the life they were living felt so much smaller than the life they could sense was possible for them. Start with the assumption, not the action, not the plan, not the strategy or the system or the carefully constructed roadmap from where you are to where you want to be. The assumption, the felt inner reality of already being where you want to be. The consciousness of arrival before the journey appears complete. The knowing of the architect before the first stone is laid. Because the cathedral is already finished in consciousness. It has always been finished in consciousness. Every desire you carry, every vision of a better life, every quiet ache for something more, something truer, something that actually matches the vastness you feel inside yourself when you are honest about it. All of it already exists as a complete and perfect pattern in the infinite intelligence that Murphy spent his life pointing you toward, not as a future possibility, as a present reality in the dimension of consciousness where all creation begins. And your only work, your only actual work in this entire process, is to close the gap between your current assumption and that already complete pattern. To align the level of consciousness you are habitually operating from with the level at which your desire already exists as fact. That is the gap. That is the only gap that has ever existed between you and the life you most deeply want. Not the gap of circumstances, not the gap of resources or connections or timing or luck or divine favor. The gap of assumption, the distance between where you think from and where your desire already lies. And that gap closes not through effort, but through elevation. Not through doing more, but through being different. Not through working harder on the outer world, but through going deeper into the inner one, into the feeling, into the state. into the quiet, settled certainty of the wish already fulfilled that Murphy found, in case after case, year after year, to be the single most reliably transformative inner posture available to a human being. He watched people step into that posture and watched their worlds reorganize around it with a consistency that never ceased to move him. He watched people who had been told by medicine that their conditions were permanent recover in ways their doctors could not explain. He watched people who had been financially devastated rebuild with a speed that defied every practical expectation. He watched relationships that had been fractured for years suddenly and unexpectedly begin to heal. He watched doors open in walls that had appeared to have no doors. He watched the universe, which is another word for the subconscious, expressing itself through the infinite field of human experience, bend toward the new assumption with the same faithful precision with which it had always bent toward the old one. And every single time, without exception, the turning point was the same. It was not a change in circumstances. It was a change in assumption. It was the moment a person stopped thinking from the problem and started thinking from the solution. Stopped thinking from lack and started thinking from fulfillment. Stopped thinking from the middle of the story and started thinking from the end. That moment, that inner shift was always the turning point. And everything that followed, every changed condition, every opened door, every healed relationship, every restored body, every unexpected abundance, was simply the outer world catching up to what consciousness had already decided. Your consciousness has the same power. The same infinite intelligence lives at the same depth in you as it lived in every person Murphy ever worked with. The law does not have favorites. It does not reserve its responsiveness for the especially devout or the unusually talented or the ones who have already suffered enough to have earned a breakthrough. It responds to the assumption, your assumption, the one you are living from right now, and the one you choose to live from tonight. So tonight, in those last soft minutes before sleep takes you, before the conscious mind releases its grip and the infinite intelligence becomes fully accessible, take the desire you have been carrying, the one you have been hoping for, working toward, perhaps quietly grieving because it has felt so long in coming. Take that desire and hold it not as a wish but as a reality, not as something you want but as something that is already yours in the dimension where all things are first created. Feel it as done. Feel it as present. Feel the specific felt sense of it already being your life, the relief of it, the ease of it. The simple, settled normalcy of a life in which that desire is not a dream but just Tuesday. Hold that feeling. Let your body know it. Let your nervous system register it as real. Let it be the last impression you give to the subconscious before sleep carries it down into the depths where creation happens. And then release it. Not with the tension of someone hoping it will work, with the ease of someone who has dropped a letter in a mailbox and knows the delivery system is reliable, with the trust of the gardener who has planted the seed and understands that the growing does not require his supervision, with the certainty of the architect who has drawn the blueprint and knows that the blueprint is the building in the only dimension where buildings are first real. And tomorrow morning, before the day asserts its claims on your attention, in those first quiet minutes of returning awareness, return to the feeling, not to check if anything has changed, not to audit the outer world for evidence of progress, simply to reconfirm the assumption, to water the seed, to reinforce the impression, to begin the day from the consciousness of arrival rather than the consciousness of seeking. And do this again the next morning, and the next, not as a rigid practice that you perform under obligation, as a natural returning to the truest thing you know about yourself, as a coming home to the level of consciousness where your desires already exist as completed patterns waiting for your consistent assumption to call them into form. Because they are waiting. Murphy was certain of this, with the certainty of a man who had spent decades watching the law operate with perfect consistency across every area of human experience. They are waiting not with indifference, but with a kind of infinite patient readiness. The way a river waits behind a dam. The way music waits in an instrument before the first note is played. the way a word waits in silence before it is spoken. The fullness of your desire is already present in consciousness. It has always been present. It was present before you were aware of wanting it. It will be present until the moment it manifests in form and beyond. It is not going anywhere. It is not growing impatient. It is not being offered to someone more worthy while you take your time finding your way to this understanding. It is yours. It has always been yours. The only question that Murphy spent his entire life helping people answer is simply this: are you willing to assume it is yours before the outer world confirms it? Are you willing to live from the end before the middle resolves? Are you willing to give your subconscious the impression of fulfillment before fulfillment is physically visible? Are you willing to think, even for the few minutes before sleep tonight, like the infinite intelligence you actually are at your deepest level? Like the God that Murphy said was never outside you, was never above you requiring approach, was never withholding from you requiring appeasement, but was always the deepest layer of your own consciousness, always present, always creative, always faithful to the impression it receives, always building, always expressing, always moving to externalize whatever assumption you are most consistently living from. That is who you are. That is what you are. That is the truth Murphy wanted you to remember above every other thing he ever said or wrote or taught. Not a technique, not a method, a truth. The truth that you are not a limited being trying to access unlimited power from outside yourself. You are unlimited intelligence temporarily focused through a particular human experience, and the limitations of that experience are not imposed on you from without. They are generated from within by assumptions that were never the truth of what you are. They are the cathedral seen from the perspective of someone who forgot they were the architect. They are the harvest judged by someone who forgot they planted the seed. They are the reflection mistaken for the source by someone who forgot they were the light. You are the light. You have always been the light. And the shadows you have been fighting, the limitations you have been struggling against, the conditions you have been trying to change from the outside, they were never anything more than the absence of your own recognition of what you are. And recognition, once genuinely arrived at, changes everything. Not gradually, immediately, at the level of assumption, which is the level of cause, which is the only level where anything has ever actually changed. So receive this now, not as information, as recognition, as the remembering of something that was never truly forgotten, only covered, only obscured by the noise of a world that had forgotten its own source and taught you to forget yours. Let it settle. Let it land. Let it become the ground you stand on rather than the idea you are considering. Let the assumption shift, right now, in this moment, from the consciousness of a limited self navigating a difficult world to the consciousness of infinite intelligence moving through a world it is simultaneously creating. From the outside into the inside out, from reaction to authorship, from hoping to knowing, from begging to being, from the basement to the penthouse, from the problem to the solution, from the seeking to the finding, from the middle of the story to the end that was always already written in the only place stories are ever first written, which is consciousness itself expressing itself as you in this unrepeatable moment that contains within it every possibility you have ever desired and every one you have not yet imagined. It is all here. It has always been here. Joseph Murphy spent his life saying so, and now you know it too. Not because someone told you, because something in you recognized it as the truth it has always been. And that recognition is the beginning of everything. It is the seed in the ground. It is the blueprint in the hand. It is the frequency finally tuned. It is the static finally resolving into music. It is done. It has always been done. Go and live as though you know it. Because now, finally, you do.